Hi everyone, my name is Yuanruo. I'm the Engineering and Hiring Manager at Open Government Products, and I will be your moderator today. Welcome to the inaugural Deep Dive session. Deep Dive is a new talk series run by OGP in partnership with other tech companies that covers in-depth software engineering topics such as engineering practices, engineering culture, and software architecture. Today's topic will be building an engineering culture. Before we start, let me introduce the format of today's session. We'll be starting with a fireside chat lasting about 25 minutes before proceeding to a Q&A of 15 minutes. As the audience, you are muted, but please feel free to add your questions during the Q&A segment. Now, let me introduce our panelists for today. We have Mr. Noah Pepper, the APAC Business Lead from Stripe, Mr. Victor Neo, the Engineering Director from Carousell, Mr. Drew Lee, the CTO of Endowus, and Mr. Lee Hong-yi, the Director of Open Government Products. So I'd like to kick off this session with a round of introductions. Could I invite our panelists to share with the audience more about yourselves and what you do in your companies? Maybe starting with Hong-yi.
Thanks, General. Hey, everyone. So my name's Hong. I'm the director of OGP, which is a sort of we're a sort of new experimental product development team within the government. Things we've built are like Parking SG, Vaccine.gov, and Go.gov, and quite a few other things. My role is, I guess, to sort of get the team to work as broadly as that is. It's very intentionally a very broad role. Basically, I do whatever is necessary in order to get the team to function well and build good products. I think that's the sort of end goal. Like, it's not really defined by what you do, it's defined by the outcome. The outcome is getting the team to deliver good products. Sometimes that means having eng discussions, sometimes that means having like sort of product direction. Sometimes it means like going to IKEA to pick up sofas so that people have a place to sit, and like setting up webcams so we can work remotely. It's whatever you need to do.
Cool. Thank you, Hong-yi. Can I pass it on to Noah?
Hey everybody, so I'm Noah. I'm the business lead for Stripe in APAC. And basically what that means is I'm accountable for the overall business results and the product quality and the kind of P&L and long-term vision of Stripe in the region. So Stripe is a global kind of financial infrastructure company. A lot of people know us for doing payments. But we do more than just that, also kind of everything from like billing systems to tax solutions and everything in between. We do a lot of that by serving engineers. And so as the business lead, a lot of what I focus on day to day is ensuring that we're building really high quality products. And that involves hiring and managing a team of product managers and engineering managers, but then also making sure that all of their work integrates tightly and well with everything from the policy team to the legal team to the partnerships team and ops and sales and marketing and everything that kind of all comes together to deliver results for our users and our customers.
Thanks, Noah. Victor, can I hand it over to you?
Yeah, hi, I'm Victor, one of the engineering directors at Carousell. Also, Carousell is our first employee and first engineer. So we're a startup headquartered in Singapore, and we've been around, I think I've been at Carousell for about 8 years. Started out as like a part-time engineer during the early days of the company. Then I moved on to being a tech lead, the first like people manager in the whole company. At one point, I even took up the role of an interim head of engineering until we hired our CTO, which I then very happily passed it on to him. So now as the director of engineering, I worked on a couple of engineering projects, portfolios, and things that are a bit too boring for other people to do, like working with auditors and all that. But also more exciting projects like, coming up with new ways of like sometimes working with engineers on interview process, sometimes thinking about like IT policies and how we can help everyone be a lot more productive. So yeah, that's me.
Thanks, Victor. And last but not least, Drew.
Hey guys, my name is Drew. I'm a CTO at Endowus. So Endowus is the digital wealth management platform. We are the first and the only digital wealth advisor for CPF, SRS, and cash. So you can, the platform enables you to manage all your wealth in one place. Endowus has been around for, I think, more than 4.5 years now. I've been with Endowus for past 3 years, initially joined as a head of engineering. But there was a fancy name for what I was doing. I was basically doing backend development for most of the times while building the tech team. For the past 1.5 years, as the team started to grow more, I start to spend more time on hiring, regulatory compliance aspect of our platforms, setting up the engineering practices and culture, but still spend quite a bit of time coding and participating in production issue as well. So yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Thanks, Drew. So today's topic is about engineering culture, and I'd like to ask the panel, what is your definition of engineering culture? And could you perhaps share also what are some of the unique aspects from each of your companies about your engineering culture? Ho, maybe you can take this on again.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, culture is a word people use to refer to a lot of things. The way I think about it is that culture is a set of both implicit and explicit sort of expectations in terms of social interaction. And so, there are a lot of the processes in a company which are a subset of culture. So, the fact if you're required to do, performance reviews or code reviews, or you're required to sort of, have sync-ups that's part of the culture. But it is not the whole culture. Like, outside of that, there is, oh, sorry, light just went off. There is a lot of how, for example, like how when people make changes to something, right? Like, is there this expectation that you can just go make a change, or like, do you need to go ask permission? And that's not something that's usually written explicitly anywhere. Sometimes it is, but a lot of times it's not, and that's part of culture. Culture is sort of like in a discussion, like who cedes ground to who on making decisions on different things, right? Like, it's very rare that you have such a clear delineation explicitly written down about who's responsible for what. And so, in a formal discussion, maybe sometimes some calls will be an engineering call versus a product call. And like, that's usually determined, I guess, empirically and heuristically across the team, and people see how this is, and that gets duplicated. And it is, I think, importantly, a persistent thing. In terms of like why it's important, I think one of the things that you, at least ironically, like the further you get into tech, the more that you realize that the hardest part about tech is the humans, more than anything else. The code itself is usually fairly straightforward, and like if you're talking about like writing the setting up monitoring systems or jobs, there are tools to do that, and they're well established. But the hardest like unknown problem is like, how do I get the right humans who want to do these things, and how do I get the different humans to work together? And culture is that. Culture is essentially your operating context and environment for all your humans to do the thing, and like that's why getting it right is pretty important. Yeah.
No, so Stripe is a very large company. Do you think the culture is different from perhaps a startup? And what do you think is unique about Stripe's culture?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts on this. So first of all, I think that Stripe's engineering culture is a really sort of strong one, and I think it's maintained that throughout the history of the company. One of the ways that I was trying to think about how to answer this, and I think one of the ways that's sort of interesting, and it relates to what Hong was saying about sort of the problems being kind of people problems, but in some ways, part of what's so strong about Stripe's culture on the engineering side is that engineers are expected to be involved in many decisions that are not purely engineering decisions, but may have consequences for engineering implementation. So I think an anti-pattern in my mind, and sort of what Stripe does not do, is treat engineering as an implementation engine. Right? There are some places in the world where companies where people will say, "Oh, I'm going to write a spec, and the salespeople will tell us what they want or whatever, and the engineers are just going to go like make it exist," and that's somehow they kind of do this back office job, right? Whereas at Stripe, it's always been the case, and even as we've grown quite a lot in the 4 to 5 years I've been there, that we now have like more product managers and salespeople and all kinds of other people that interact with the customer. But the engineer is expected to really understand the customer's problem, why we're building what we're building, who we're building it for, what their pain points are, how it changes their lives, and that really visceral, intuitive understanding and bringing engineers into all of those decisions makes it a very engineering-led company. And so that's a big part of it. And when I first joined, when I first talked to the company back in 2013, I met one of the founders, and basically they essentially only employed engineers. There was like a couple sort of edge cases where they'd hire other people, but it was essentially purely like engineers building an API for other engineers and a company of all engineers. And as we've grown, we've built a lot more other kinds of products and a lot of things that have UIs, and like we're building stuff for like finance professionals and CFOs and people who are like sending out invoices. And so we've had to like hire product managers who will go sit and walk through wireframes and stuff like that. But even in those conversations, engineers are kind of tuned in and paying attention and involved in the strategy, in the decision-making, things like that. And I think that's very important. And even through the way we kind of look at our org and our org structure, we tend to have folks with engineering experience and background in senior leadership roles, cross-functionally responsible for the company's success.
Thanks, Noah. I'd like to ask Victor, as the first engineer at Carousell, you must have seen the company grow leaps and bounds. What do you think the culture, how do you think the culture has changed throughout your time at the company? And what do you think is unique about Carousell?
I think of course, the early days, it's almost like it's very hard to even say like there's a culture. So the way we do things as a sort of early group, just the founders and the engineers, were quite scrappy in a sense. We have some ideas, we'll focus on building it together. But then sort of as the team grew, I think a couple of things started to stand out. And I think and it's one of our company's core values as well, which is to care very deeply for the user. And that's where, like even during the product development process, like engineers are also voicing out like their thoughts, joining like mind mapping, brainstorming activities with the product designers, like even having discussions with the business folks on like what's the best way to do things. Because at the end of the day, it's sort of like what Noah mentioned, like it's not just about just writing code. It's really about understanding like what's the user's problem that we're solving and what we're doing. So I felt like that was like developed over time, like organically, simply because like some of us started doing it early, and then people who joined followed as well. And I think the other aspect that sort of came up was that you would have engineers who are on the other end of the spectrum where they just want to write code. They don't want to be involved in a lot of all these things. And those are the ones where you actually do have to be quite explicit and communicate about that. Like we do expect our engineers to do more than just coding. You are supposed to be involved in the process. You need to understand what's your user's problem. So I think as the organization grows, while some of these things are implicit, like culture, there are times where people come from different companies' backgrounds and worked in very different environments. Like communicating about it helps to make sure that like you're quite clear about certain things, and it's sort of just let it develop organically from there. So yeah, so it's just sort of a mix of match of things. And of course, over time, we've also integrated like people and how they work, best practices into like how we work daily. And I felt like that's also one of the more fun things that I've seen as the culture evolved over time.
Thanks, Victor. Drew, I like to find out more about the culture of your company. I think your company, there's a financial service aspect to it. Do you think that has influenced your culture in any way?
It does. We're still in the early stage. So compared to Carousell, Stripe, Open Government, I think Endowus is probably at the earliest stage of the company, and we are still going through the process to find our engineering culture. But there is one thing that we did pretty well in our first 3 years, and that is to have the empathy in the team. This may sound a bit weird, but I strongly believe that the emotional support between the team member is what's probably the most important in building the productive and enjoyable working culture. So so we provide quite a lot of empathy to each other. And I want to make sure our engineers feel safe about expressing their personal issues, sharing mistakes with others, speaking up without having this fear of harsh criticism. I think that's what I've been trying to focus more on. And that's something that we have as a culture already. So recently we had one of our key engineers. He had to went on the extended leave for some personal reasons, and he went through really difficult time. And during his absence, his team members were really like volunteering to share his responsibilities, and they're trying to basically make his absence as unnoticeable as possible, so he can focus purely on solving his personal issues without having to worry about delaying the project or even about his job security and everything. And really like that was pretty impressive. And after he came back, when he openly shared about what happened to him to the company, he got a lot of supporting messages, like some of them even share the similar experience with him. So this whole like entire process, I think, made the engineering team and the engineering culture more stronger. But there's a financial aspect to it, so which means like when there's an issue with our system or production issue, it means it's most likely the issue with someone else's money, someone else's precious savings. So when something like that happens, everybody gets very intense and very nervous. But that's even more why like that's why we need to have this comforting kind of culture where everyone is not hesitating to share their own mistake with each other. So yeah.
Thanks, Drew. I think one very interesting thing that you brought up is basically the having a culture of psychological safety. And I think given the pandemic, a lot of us have had to work from home, and invariably that not only includes the engineers, but large sections of the company. Do you think the pandemic has significantly affected the culture in your companies or on your teams?
Me? Is it to?
Yes,
Okay.
if you like to, or if anyone else would like to take it up too.
Definitely the like fully remote environment makes it a little bit more difficult to have the bonding. It was actually quite challenging, and we had these cases where we hire someone 100% remotely, and then the person didn't really get along very well in the company, and then he had to leave without ever even get an opportunity to meet others in person during the pandemic when things were quite worse. I think it happened when we are not totally prepared for this kind of like fully remote environment, but we're getting used to it. I think we're getting better at it, better at this. But yeah, I want to know how others are doing about it.
Noah, your organization is a global organization, and I'm sure that comes with a lot of challenges as well, especially during COVID. Would you like to share more?
Yeah, totally. I'll try to go back and focus too. So it was interesting because both we're a global organization, but we're also one that's very focused on writing as a major part of the culture, right? And a lot of, I think, early stage startups, folks end up in sort of, all in one room, kind of hashing things out together. In a lot of other kinds of organizations, there's a lot of slide decks or things like that that get used to communicate. And at Stripe, it's a lot of memos and written docs. And I think that as a result, when we're all physically distant from one another, and also in many cases, time zone distant from one another, this kind of having these artifacts that are created that transmit knowledge through sort of both time and space, if we want to be a little bit grandiose about it, are really effective. And I think that writing culture made it a lot easier for us to navigate the kind of change to remote working and the pandemic. I also think that I noticed a pivot in our culture to become, we're a really fast-paced organization and folks work really hard. And I think it was kind of really comforting to see us temper that appropriately as the pandemic hit and folks had a difficult time. But at the same time, balance that with continuing a really fast pace of execution, because we ended up in a situation where during lockdowns and things like that, more businesses needed to use us to go online than ever before. And so we felt a real obligation to not fall short, not have incidents, and continue sort of pushing forward during that. And so that was kind of an interesting balance to strike of making sure that we create room for people to sort of deal with their human problems and the very real sort of issues that we all face. And I think for a lot of us, it's also just involved things like, I don't know, my kids joined a lot of meetings, and they could join this one. So just to warn everybody.
Thanks, Noah. Victor, I know like online shopping has been a big thing during the pandemic, but at Carousell, I think frequently buyers are expected to meet up with each other. Has the pandemic affected your business and your culture in a significant way at all?
Yeah, I think if it's, I think maybe specifically on at least shopping habits, thankfully, I think in most of the markets that we operate in, there has been a increase in like delivery options that allow people to actually meet up and do. So interestingly, I think with the sort of pandemic in most markets, including Singapore, people still found a way to deal, to meet up, to transact. I think especially if they're stuck at home, the chance of them buying things across like Carousell and all platforms have increased dramatically. And so far, with all the like delivery options available, that has availed people ways to do that. But I think cultural wise for us, I think one fortunate thing that we did was again similar to what Noah mentioned, we were in the midst of transitioning to a more written approach, a synchronous working approach prior to like the whole pandemic started. So when the time came to switch to fully working remote, so I also work with our corporate IT team, and it's been sort of like we're just waiting and see like how many things would happen once we started working remotely, and turns out like nothing went wrong. So we were fortunate that like we were equipped with like both tools and processes to help people actually work remotely without too much issues to begin with. But I think one of the things that we sort of spent a lot of time to focus on was things like how to do team bonding better. So that involved a lot of games over Zoom, a lot of activities that we'll do, a lot more frequent talks. Even for us, like for Tech Talk, we would also have both our own people doing more sharing, given that there's less opportunity for you to just casually meet up and chat, but also invite like external speakers. So I feel like overall, as a sort of as a package, there are ways to sort of overcome that. Not quite the same as meeting up one-on-one and talking about it, but people don't have to feel disconnected. And then we can make Zoom meetings more fun and reduce the number of meetings with more documents. That's what I feel.
Thanks, Victor. Hong, so one follow-up question for you, I think the audience will be very keen to know, is that obviously governments have been facing a lot more pressure to get things done and solve things well during the pandemic. What do you think OGP as the experimental unit of GovTech, what kind of expectations do you think has uniquely fallen onto government and OGP in particular, and what do you think that has meant for our culture?
So I think there's a few things. So I think the big thing that's changed in the past year and a year or two is that we've had to move a lot more quickly than government is traditionally used to. Because there's always this, there's always this sort of luxury of time that the government assumes it has, and so it's like, oh, yes, it's a big change, it's very important, we need to get this done, but because it's so important, let's take our time, let's plan it, let's consider, let's go. But I think in the past year, that's definitely not been the case. Like, yeah, this is super important, but you've got like 2 weeks to get this out, because every week that you delay is like another chance for outbreak, another chance for infection, or even if you just slow down the economy opening up by another week, by another week, that's like literally people's livelihoods that that are going offline. And so there's this weird sort of I guess convergence of both importance as well as urgency that the government is not very used to, and that's sort of where OGP comes in. Because like most of the government structures are designed to do big things, but taking time, right? And so they have a big contract for don't know how many tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to build this big system out. But if you need to get people vaccinated, you've got to do it in the next month. Like, how do you set up a system in a couple of weeks to let people make appointments and people can keep track of all these things? And so that's where we come in. And the culture here is actually pretty important because like in a sort of more structured organization, the culture could be around like, yes, here's my role, let me fulfill my role, make sure nothing, we do things about consistently. On OGP, the culture is very much focused around public impact as opposed to particular processes, which means that our processes on a day-to-day basis are less consistent than a traditional organization might be. But it means that when you need to have a very sort of new environment come in, like for example, build a product you haven't built before, it is easier for us to sort of like pivot around that and like, okay, well, yeah, I mean, this is the goal. We have to get something launched, right? It's fine if, and you know, if we need to discard how we normally, for example, do an end review or something like that, just because we need to launch something. We do so because, you know, yes, it may not be great, but great in the next week is better than perfect in 2 months' time. And I think that's I think that's some of a big part of it. The culture and the team around this internally, the thing that shifted a lot for us, that was very different, is because the team traditionally didn't interface a lot with the rest of the government, precisely because we work in such a very different way. And so we were previously very deliberate in sort of like budding off and like minimizing the human interface surface area between our organization as well as other government agencies. Right? It's not that we don't, but it's like, okay, we're building this product for you, and then the product is like that. We've got it built, and then now we work with you. This is how you use it. This is how you come on board. Here's the APIs. Here's the interface, and you just sort of go from there. And that works well when you can sort of like self-contain certain particular things, and the problem is pretty well defined. The problem is that it's not just fast, but the problem's also not very well defined, right? To give you an example, I mean, the thing that's most apparent for this is that when we're building the vaccine appointment system, the policies around the vaccine appointments changed like many times over the last few months, right? Whether appointments are 2 weeks out, 3 weeks out, whether you have like 1 jab, 2 jabs, whether like how many people are getting jabs, how many appointments are coming up, like who's allowed to book first, who's allowed to book next, things like that. These all change on a daily basis. And like that's meant that instead of like it sort of being this like very like simple, like small connection point, we needed to sort of like have this very high interface with the rest of government. And that created a very big impedance mismatch between our team as well as the rest of the government. So within OGP, like there is this sort of expectation, for example, of what urgent means, you know, and we don't use urgent. Urgent means, you know, yes, this is on fire, we need to fix it right now. But in other places, urgent could be like, oh, my boss really wants this. It's, you know, and it's not actually like a national crisis. It's just that, oh, he really wants this, you know, because he needs to go off or something like that. And different people have different measures of what's urgent. And so when you have our team, which is, let's say, like literally a team of 5 people, interface with like 5 different departments across the Ministry of Health, as well as the sort of like, you know, military who's doing the operations for the vaccinations, you have 5 different definitions of the word urgent from 5 different people. And like, you can feel the sort of a communication mismatch sort of causing tensions on the team, because one person on the team would think like, oh, I spoke to the user and he thinks this thing is super important. I spoke to this user, he thinks this thing is super important. I spoke to this user and this thing is very important. And that like that, I mean, you know, that sort of form requirements to keep a very high interface, but then having different cultures intermix and therefore having different communication expectations come in, resulted in a lot of miscommunication about what happened there. So part of this is like figuring out very strategically what the interface is like. So a very simple thing I said, we put in was that like, okay, urgent means if someone tells you something is urgent, urgent means they call me as the team director in order to clear something if it's actually urgent. If it's not worth waking me up for and not worth calling me for, then it's not urgent for you either. Like that was a very clear thing. And actually, you know, if you a lot of things that were like, oh yes, very urgent, but when you say okay, but then let's escalate, and they're like, actually, okay, it's probably not worth escalating, then it turns out like, you know, that sort of empirical bar for importance dropped a little bit, and like, you know, it allowed it to sort of maintain a standard. And so that was where a lot of our language calibration came in. And so from our side, as a very simple funny example is the team, you know, for those of us who did NS and everything, you know, there's this term ConOps, and then you know when you're doing military stuff, they like to use this term warning order. Warning order is like, you know, sort of like the sort of memo they send around, which is like, this is what we're going to be doing for the operation. But for people on the team who were not in the military, they were like so confused why we were receiving these warning order notes from them. What does a warning order mean? And like, we just had to be like, no, that's just what they call like a briefing thing for the rest of it. And so you don't have to freak out about it. So yeah, just things like that. Like you can sort of see very clearly where it interfaced and how the interface points in the different sort of cultures in the different agencies really created frictions with our particular engineering culture and how we had to adapt to that. Yeah.
Thanks, Hong. I'd like to find out more from Noah as well, because Stripe is the global payments infrastructure provider, and by definition, infrastructure has to be pretty stable. So do you think the engineering practices in Stripe would be very different from, say, a startup that's trying to find its own space? And famously, Stripe also has a pretty strict API review process. So do you think there's any trade-off to be made there, being having API stability versus like opening up new business functions or expanding into new markets?
So one of the most useful concepts that I learned about, years ago that I really loved is this concept of pace layers. And so you can just Google pace layers, but there's sort of this idea of different parts of society or a company or whatever can move at different rates of change. And so one of the things that we think about is there are some things at Stripe that need to move really, really, really fast, and some things that need to move, reasonably quickly, but more carefully. Everything that we try to do everything like relatively quickly because we're a sort of urgent kind of organization or a fast moving kind of organization. So some of our newer businesses maybe have less users, maybe have less. Here, another mental model that I'll share is this notion of a trapdoor decision. So people talk about sometimes like type 1, type 2 decisions. It's kind of a similar idea, but one-way door or two-way door. A two-way door decision, I can make the decision and I can unmake the decision very easily, right? So like, I could change the icon color of our app and I can unchange that relatively instantaneously. And it's no one's really worse off. However, if I make an API change that's maybe going to break somebody, that's a very trapdoor decision. And I can't undo that easily, right? And so you mentioned our sort of API review process. Yeah, we're really careful about changes that we make to the API because we don't really deprecate API versions almost ever. And we're very careful about that because we know that when someone builds on us, we want sort of this, implicit kind of relationship contract that assures them that they can rely on us and not get broken and not have their bit. I mean, if we change something and it breaks for them, like their business is offline and they stop making money, which is, we think really bad. And so we do everything that we can to make that not happen. And so we take those sort of responsibilities very seriously. As a result, we move some parts of the organization a bit slower, whereas other things can iterate much faster. And so then that kind of extends into how we think about decision making. So certain types of decisions are such serious kind of one-way doors that our CEO will get involved in that decision, right? Even at the scale that we're at. And then there's other decisions that they're reversible enough that an IC engineer should just go make that decision. And if it doesn't work out, we'll figure it out. We'll fix it later. And so we try to think about that and teach folks to think about that, so that way we can let the organization be more autonomous. Because the more autonomous your organization is, the faster you can move. Back to the point that Hong brought about earlier, a lot of the problems in a software engineering organization are people, and a lot of people problems come when you have more and more people and the number of connections between people grows exponentially or geometrically, and then you have this problem of like, how do I make decisions, how many people need to be aligned, things like that. So we try to simplify and create sort of key decision makers who can own the outcome for sort of varying levels of sort of important or trapdoor decisions.
Thanks, Noah. Victor, I have a question for you. I think some members of the audience are curious from when you build out an engineering organization, how do you know if the team is actually scaling faster than the managers who are able to keep up with that? And I think given your unique position as a successful startup and the first engineer on Carousell, do you think there were ever times when you felt that maybe some of the managers weren't keeping up with the growth at Carousell, or maybe your personal experiences, like say from the time when you felt that you did need to hire that CTO?
Yeah, I think probably the one that I feel the most that wasn't growing fast enough with the organization as a manager was myself. I was the fresh graduate out of school, and I mean subsequently we did hire a couple more managers, and especially for managers we did try to hire people with experience, like with leadership experience and those with managing experience. But I was the one who was like new to everything, new to the role, new to being a manager. And that sort of created this thing where, like, so always a cycle of learning, unlearning, and relearning, like what it means to be a leader, what it means to be a manager. So that, I think when going through that cycle was pretty painful. But for us, I think as the organization scaled and grew, the level of leadership and direction you need to provide to the teams also changed. Which is why I think at some point when we were like, before we decided to hire our CTO, and then, with me taking up the interim head of engineering position, it was a good chance to sort of step in and experience what it was like, what we were lacking, what were the challenges that we have. And during that process, I actually did like a lot of one-on-ones with the CEO on the founders of the company, and we had a lot of discussions like, like what sort of engineering culture we want, what would be great for Carousell. And that, I think, also helped to sort of help us figure out like what sort of CTO we want to hire, what sort of caliber, what sort of skill sets this person should have. And I think that also helped to shape a lot of what we wanted to see from the engineering organization later, right? So it's not just coding, just get things done, but also like, oh, these are the things we want to be proud of as an organization. And they give us a lot of chance to do it. Yeah, so I would say like generally managers grow, some in different paces, some with strengths and weaknesses. The one that I can probably speak for most is like myself, because I know myself the best. I know how much like I felt like I was inadequate a lot of times. But fortunately, I think with the leadership hires that we have made later, a lot of peers, a lot of like more senior leaders that I could learn from. And I think once they were in place, the rest of the organization also, like engineers had someone they could talk to and get mentorship from, and so on. So I felt like under investing in hiring good senior leaders is probably one of the killers for your engineering culture and organization if they are growing rapidly.
Thanks, Victor. Drew, I have a follow-up question for you. Have you ever encountered situations where maybe your business stakeholders or partners did not actually buy into your engineering culture? Or do you actually have come across like any engineers who actually resist having additional engineering practices or guardrails being in place among them as your startup?
So, I mean, about the first about part on, what like the business stakeholders, are disagreeing with the engineering practices. Fortunately, we didn't have that experience so far. I mean, I time to time I get some feedback from the business side that we are little too caring. I mean, we need to like, probably the message is that you guys need to deliver more. But the thing is that we, even that feedback, we as a team, engineering team, don't really perceive it as a resistance to our culture. We totally accept it as a valid feedback from the business side. So it's like we think that we almost think that they have right to say such thing, and it is for us to explain better, like why we are doing it in this kind of, following these engineering practices. Why do we need these practices now when we didn't have it before? It is really like our job, my job especially, to explain that and get that buy-in from the business side. So that has been pretty smooth so far, even when the company is growing exponentially. And yes, I did have engineer who were quite resistant to the culture that I was trying to establish. I think in the end, the engineer left the organization. I mean, I think this is one of the thing about I mean, so we nowadays I don't think any startup has to worry about how to fire engineers, because the engineers tend to have so many options nowadays. You just like it is so if what I'm saying, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that if the fit is not there, I think the departure is not as painful as before, because the engineers have so many options. And maybe it is painful for employer to lose engineer nowadays, but if the individual is not willing to accept the culture that we are trying to establish, then that's inevitable decision, I guess. Yeah.
Thanks, Drew. Each of you are fairly senior engineering leaders in Singapore, and I think one thing that we're all quite curious about is how do you see the engineering talent scene in Singapore developing? Like, can Singapore become the next Silicon Valley? Are we able to provide a meaningful career advancement especially for senior engineers as the tech scene in Singapore grows over time? I was wondering what each of you may have any thoughts on that. Maybe Noah, starting with you as a fairly major presence in Singapore with Stripe.
Yeah, I mean, we're really excited about our engineering hub investment in Singapore, and that was a decision that we made a number of years ago to put our regional hub here. Look, I think there's a huge amount of phenomenal talent here. I think there's, as I think all of us are seeing, there's sort of a lot of competition for that talent. There's not sort of enough, in terms of the amount of hiring that we want to do. That's a problem that exists globally. There's, I don't think there's any pocket of the planet at the moment where there are sort of more engineers than people who want to hire those engineers. I think that the sort of question about kind of whether this can become sort of the next Silicon Valley is a really interesting one, in the sense of, sort of what do we mean by that? And I think there's, so first of all, I'm not, really a crypto expert, but a lot of people I know from the crypto community have gravitated towards Singapore for various reasons, and that's creating sort of a critical mass of people. And I think that critical mass is sort of the seed kind of gravity that you need. I would really think about something like a Silicon Valley as being a gravitational force, where there's a certain mass of folks that then more folks sort of come to that location, that place, that community, because they're drawn there, and it becomes an accelerant for the mission that they're on and the things that they want to go build. And I think so I think that's kind of like one potential promising seed. I think there's a number of very sort of large, successful late stage companies that are local here, like Grab, that I think are really important to that ecosystem and kind of part of, as you think about sort of the ecosystem being developed. And then there's folks like a Stripe or other notable folks like Facebook or Google who put a lot of folks here. And those are, I think, also important parts of the ecosystem. So similar to sort of like a biological ecosystem, you need a bunch of these different players. You need these sort of larger, more mature organizations that teach people how to operate at scale, that are really good for training new grad engineers as they come into the market, things like that. You need these sort of homegrown successes, like the Grabs, that sort of create a lot of vision and excitement around entrepreneurship and sort of making the example. Carousell is an example. That's something that's like kind of later stage and seeing sort of that growth deliver. So engineers are willing to take the risky bets, right, and go somewhere that's much earlier stage. And then I think you also need the sort of more like very speculative, like I'm going to go sort of mess around and kind of play with ideas stuff. I think crypto's in that space. I think very, very early stage startups kind of look like that, where there's kind of a blurred line between like work and play almost. And you need sort of the time and the space and the population of people doing that to sort of have things knocking around where new ideas kind of form, and then new things are created. And I think that we have a bunch of the early kind of components of that. And I think there's been a lot of smart work on the government side, things like the tech pass work and stuff like that, to try to create, like sort of accelerate making more of that center of gravity happen. And so I'm personally very bullish on that scene and kind of interested to see what else we can do to have more of that happen.
Thanks, Noah. Victor, as someone who has seen Carousell grow, do you think I think Carousell is clearly a household name at this point, but may not have been in 2015. So I was just wondering, has that increase in recognition and that increase in growth, and that have you seen, how have you felt as an engineering leader at Carousell as your company gained in success? Do you think it was a lot easier, for example, when Noah talked about I think being able to attract the engineers, or just in a sense of has things been easier on our tech scene as a homegrown?
Yeah, I think it's been easy. It has made certain things easier and certain things harder. I think easier if you have been looking up like startups in this region or in Singapore, then yes, I think Carousell's name will come up somewhere. I think I've spoken to a few candidates where they did their research and they simply found like, okay, which startup had funding in this year and all that. And that's how they come across our name as well. And of course, I think from those who have used our product, I think what's made it easier, of course, people know the name. They sort of, if they know, they recognize it, then they trust it more implicitly. But I think the other one where sort of it's the owners and us as leaders is to make sure that we're creating that environment and a culture where these engineers come in and be successful. And people do expect that, like once you're a certain size, once you're a certain level, they have expectations on how you would do things, what's the level of quality that you do, level of what, like not just the engineering quality, like product and everything that comes out that the user sees, right? So I think those are the two things that comes hand in hand. Like you don't get the recognition, and then people come in and can just still be as scrappy and random as you do things. People's expectations do rise, and if you're hiring, of course, top talent, smart people, then they're just gonna come in and say, "Oh, I'm just gonna sit there and code." They're gonna expect things to evolve, things to change, and you have to create an environment where they can do that. So I would say, yeah, I mean, it's made things easier and harder, but I don't think anyone joins a startup because they want an easy way out. So I think that's part of the fun.
Thanks so much, Victor. That was a very good insight. Yeah, so we're actually at the end of our allotted time, and we'd like to transit to the Q&A segment now. So looking at the Q&A section, the audience, please don't forget to upvote the questions that you'd like to be answered. I will go through by the number of upvotes, so please go and upvote accordingly. Starting from our first question from an anonymous attendee, the question is, how do you face issues with burnout within your organization? How do you deal with that? Hong, as we know, OGP has been working very hard over the past 1.5 years. What do you think? How do you think we've been dealing with burnout within the government, within our team?
So there's a few things, right? So burnout isn't just a single dimensional problem. So the one is workload. I mean, workload is obviously a big thing, but and if people are working many hours a day, they're going to get burnt out, and that's one thing. But apart from that, actually, there's a few other dimensions which make a big difference. One is externally, like, do you feel like the work you're doing matters? So if someone's working very hard, but they feel like their work matters, actually they like, they feel purpose. They understand why they're doing it. Burnout is about like, I don't know why am I doing this. I have no motivation to continue or anything like that. And so like this idea of like, you have to be very clear with people why it is what you're doing. And it seems on a day-to-day basis, this doesn't show up. But when you don't do this for like a few months, people start being like, I'm not sure where we're going in. So a lot of people's burnout is about this perception of the future. There's another part to it, which is also like the sort of like bonds with the rest of the team. So it's the whole like, sort of like, World War I kind of fighting in the trenches, right? You're not fighting for your country, you're fighting for the guy next to you. And that's often a big part of it, where people who are more connected to the organization, to their coworkers, to the people, the people they see on a daily basis, they're like, yeah, I mean, we go through this, but we go through this together, and it makes sense. Whereas if you don't feel that connection, then actually any minor friction in the team becomes a terrible friction, right? Like, so if you have a very strong sense of like, you have a very strong sense of where the team culture is, like, and where like, and you get along well with your colleagues, and you know what you guys are trying to do. Actually, a lot of the tough stuff, you go ahead. You can still overwork people, to be clear. And so it's not just that, but these are the sort of different dimensions. So the few things that we've been doing to try and address this, right? I think the first one is just sort of recognizing that hours worked is like the limiting factor to humans being productive in groups is not like hours worked. It's like it's this how much sort of energy that people have in the team. And if you're it's like a car, right? Like, it's not about how much you press the accelerator, it's about how much gas you have in the tank. And like, actually it makes most like you need to optimize for people to take breaks and go in, and not because, oh yes, it's not welfare. Like, you're actually getting, even in a race, right? Even in your Formula 1 race, people need to make pit stops, because if you don't make a pit stop, you burn out literally on track. And so making sure you modulate the workload, I think it's very important. And it's probably like over 1 or 2 weeks, hell, even months, you might be able to like just have people sort of burn candle at both ends. But over the course of like 6 months, your productivity is maximized by optimizing for proper rest as opposed to optimizing for working many long hours. I think that's very clear. The other two bits in terms of purpose and like and people, like that's just an open-ended question. There's no one solution to it, and it depends about the organization. I think it's very like on a day-to-day basis, you have a lot of things to do and might be, you know, might seem very unimportant to sort of say why you're doing things, but you know, actually it might seem trivial, but what I've realized, you know, you have to keep reminding people like, hey, this is why we're doing this. And when you have impact on someone, when there are stories of someone benefiting from the work that you've done, you need to share it back to people. And it's not just a pat on the back, you know, it's really just giving people that like, if people want to go look for it, they can look for it, but it takes a lot of mental energy to go find reasons why you're doing something. And if you can give that to them and they can sort of see it in front of them, I think that becomes very clear. And the last bit is really just, I think it's been the hardest bit over the past year and a half. When people have been in office and, you know, and they sort of get to know each other and they have lunch together and they sort of see each mannerisms, there's a lot of implicit communication about people go. But what I found is that like when people are working a bit more remotely, it's not like minor frictions end up causing a lot more trouble than they would have previously. So if you have, it's like if you're friends, right, and like you know you sort of like rip on each other or you sort of like, you know, joke with each other, and the closer you are as friends, the sort of like harsher your joke can be, because you know that there's this implicit trust between you guys. But whereas when you don't know someone very well, even the minor slight becomes like something that like becomes a source of tension and conflict. And like if you look at just what people are complaining about, you might think that, oh yeah, people like don't say that or don't do this or make sure we have a clearer process for this and that. And you know, because the string is so tight that any small perturbation you want to sort of keep it go. But actually the correct answer I found a lot is to sort of like slacken the string, not to stop any from these misunderstandings from happening, but making it such that people know each other better. They just have some time to chat with each other, work with each other for a bit, like spend time around each other and seeing how they are rather than sort of just formally over Zoom. And that's been helping quite a lot. I mean, concrete things that we've been doing, like we're sort of help, you know, we try to mandate people to take leave. You try to push people to take block leave. You try to make sure that you don't have too much disruption in life. You try to make sure people have time to get to know their colleagues. There's all this stuff that is very important to getting people working productive outside of like the literal typing on the keyboard work. Yeah.
Thanks, Hong. Our next question comes from Bala Navan. Says, I'm the first engineer for an early stage startup, and I'm interested to know from the panel their hiring journey in the early days. How did you go from 0 to 1 to 100, and what did that look like? Drew, I was wondering, could you share some of your experiences with your startup?
So we're not 100 yet. We're almost there, but not there yet. But I can tell you how we grow. So in the very early stage, you have no option but to reach out to your network of friends. So you have to find the friends who are brave enough to follow you and make this bold decision to join an early stage startup. It takes some gut from me as well, because I have to convince them that this will survive, this will become something, so let's be part of the dream. That convincing process, it cannot be successful if you don't have any existing trust with the individual. So I did this twice. So once back in Stashaway and second time in Endowus, the team building exercise. Both times the very early the engineers we hired was from my own network of people, and then so that's how you grow from 0 to 10, I guess. And then 10 to 30, I guess the answer is you have to ask these friends who joined after you to reach out to their friends, and that really worked out very well for us. For example, I think we have almost everyone who used to be in the same team back in Redmart, currently working for backend team in Endowus. So yeah, I mean, if you are treating them well, I mean, and if you are, if the company is growing and if they see the future in you, they will invite their friends to join them. So that's how we got to 30. And I guess But from now on, we feel like we pretty much exhaust all the network. So we are doing everything we can, like recruiting, engaging recruiters. We're currently looking for tech recruiter to in-house tech recruiter, and doing this kind of webinar, attending career fair, everything we can. So we haven't got to 100 yet. So maybe someone else can tell that.
Right, thank you so much, Drew. I think in the interest of time, we'll try and like do a couple more questions instead of continuing on this one. So Yan Chang Chen asked, what do you think in your respective organization is the biggest push and pull for an engineer to stay put? And I think, Victor, now that Carousell has been around for some time, have you seen many engineers leave or join? And what number, for example, of the original founding team is or founding early stage engineers are still around?
Yeah, I think the unfortunate thing is that, I mean, given I've been around since the start, I've seen everyone join and everyone who has left has left. But not in a bad way, I think. I think generally people do leave, and if they do leave to learn new skills or try a different environment, I think that's a good thing overall, especially in like the tech scene in Singapore, where it's good for people to go around and they can spread their knowledge and all that. So I feel like push and pull factors that I feel like during the early days, of course, I think a lot of struggles with just survival, trying to figure out what we want to do. And sort of a lot of the technical decisions you do back then aren't always the best because you're trying to figure out like what would stick and what would work. And then later on, I would say it became when you have a lot more people, then it became like, how do you want your culture to be? How do you want people to work together? And then of course, sometimes when you have a lot of people join at the same time, I think there was a year where we grew from 25 people in tech overall, including like engineers, product managers, and all that, to almost 100. When you grow like 4 times in a span of over a year, you're gonna get a lot of like cultural conflicts, and at the same time, like people trying to figure out like what is the right thing to do now, how do you evolve this process, and that's also gonna cause a lot of push-pull factors for people as well. Some people like the chaos, and some people want things to be like documented down to every bullet point on what you should do and shouldn't do. And I think like some of these factors still exist today. Like I think one big thing for us is a team as an engineer, not just product manager and engineers. Everyone in the team needs to own, like you own everything. So like product decisions or engineering decisions, uptime, downtime, even like infrastructure to whatever components that you own. Some people like that, some people don't. So I would say like there are a lot of all these things that still happen. But I think it's just whether you can accept the fact that, like people leaving for reasons that, like cultural things that you are able to accept, versus like people telling you, oh, I just hate this, I just gotta go. And then that's where leaders need to, like take in all this feedback and from people who have left and decide like, okay, how important is this to address? Because I think listening from people who leave is important, but also very important for those who are still here, so that they don't burn out and don't like just hate their job eventually and go as well.
Thanks, Victor. One last question, I think, especially for Noah. Eugene writes, thanks for sharing on writing culture. I think the reluctance to start writing is this need to write perfectly before we publish. And how does Stripe overcome that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Several things. Part of this is just, as with anything, whether it's like shipping a product or shipping a document, it's getting comfortable putting things out in the world that aren't 100% perfect, because if you wait till that point, you've certainly waited too long. So that's part of it. Part of it's also just developing the writing skill such that you feel more confident in the things that you're writing. And a lot of that is just practice. It's doing more writing. And I think one technique that you might use is do more writing for lower stakes things, right? Like it's one thing if you're going to write a document that you're going to put in front of like your entire company or your whole engineering team or your CEO or whatever, right? But if you get into the habit of saying our team has to make a decision, I'm going to write up a 1-page document to articulate the pros and cons of the choice in front of us. And then we'll all, the 5 of us will sit down, read it and add comments and then talk about it. And if you just do that all the time, it becomes a habit, you develop the skill, and when it comes time to write higher stakes documents, you do a better job and feel more confident. I think for important documents where I'm trying to make a key decision, I'm gonna sort of publish it more broadly. I often will write things and then rewrite them, right? I think there was recently a program essay where he talked about writing, and I think you referenced P.G. Wodehouse, basically like for some of his books, like literally rewriting the entire thing like multiple times. And that's somebody who's like professional, like well-respected, like known writer. And so I think that is part of the what you're signing up for if you're creating sort of something that you want to be a canonical document or a really important piece. And so you just have to modulate your investment depending on the number of people involved, how critical it is, things like that.
Thanks, Noah. So with that, we've come to the end of our time. So I really like to thank the panelists, Noah, Victor, Drew, and Hong for making time to answer all these questions and share your insights. And thank you so much to the audience for making time to attend this. We will have a survey at the end of this. So please do help us as the organizers to give some feedback. And if there's anything we can improve on, we'd like to know. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a good day, good evening ahead. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
You.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.